Empire.
Hello and welcome to my podcast. Do me a favor, subscribe to the John Kahn Report wherever you get your podcast. You're watching on YouTube, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. You can find us there as part of Empire Media. That's AMPIRE. Always much appreciated when you tune in. Today, I'm joined by Sports Illustrated's Albert Breer, who wrote an article earlier this week on the Washington Commanders' soon-to-be owner, Josh Harris. Now, of course, that still has to go through the voting process. Hasn't gotten there yet. May not happen till August. The Harris Group is very optimistic that it'll occur. Still some things to be worked out, but Albert wrote an article on Harris, talking to a few people who know him very well. And so I wanted to bring him in to give you some insight into Josh Harris and what kind of owner he might be based on some of the people Albert has talked to. We also talk about Sam Howell. What are some of the perceptions, things that he's heard about Howell, whether from the Commanders or thoughts from the outside, and also Chase Young. His thoughts on, both Albert and I went to Ohio State. We watched Chase Young throughout college. What does he think about Chase Young's future? So we get into all that. So stay tuned for that. Before I get there, don't forget you can read my work on ESPN.com. And, there you go. Now, a couple things before I get to my conversation with Albert. One of the things I forgot to tell you about in my OTA wrap-up that went up Thursday morning and from Wednesday's practice. Actually, the podcast went up Thursday night. The video went up, the podcast went up Wednesday night. The video went up Thursday morning. Anyway, in that, I forgot to tell you about Jamin Davis. He had a minor cleanup procedure on his knee, so he is not out there right now. So just wanted to give you that update. Khaleke Hudson was working in his place. I can't tell you how well he did because I wasn't focused on him. I will probably watch him a little bit later because I think he's a person to watch throughout the spring. He had a really good final game. They know it. They're sort of intrigued by, is that a springboard for him or what? So I'll get into a little bit more of that in future episodes when I have a chance to pay more attention. But anyways, there you go. I can't remember, so if I'm repeating myself here, bear with me. But in the OTA wrap-up, one of the things I originally did was talked about the offensive line, and then I had to re-record it because the sound was really bad. Anyway, so when I re-recorded, I can't remember if I mentioned about Ricky Stromberg, the rookie center. One thing to know that it was Nick, the center position was Nick Gates. He's going to start there. This isn't a competition. Nick Gates is going to start. They really like him. They like his presence in the huddle. I've heard good things about him there, but he's going to be the starting center. Tyler Larson was working with the twos. In some individual and group sessions, Ricky Stromberg was working with the threes. When they went to full team work, it was Nolan Laufenberg working with the threes. Now, that's just where Stromberg is starting, but I just want to pass it along. What does it mean? Really not a whole lot yet because he's not someone they're expecting to play this year anyway. But as a third-round pick, your job is to get ready to start within the next year or two. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of update on that. There's a lot for him to learn, and when you're a center, there's really a lot to learn. So I wouldn't read anything into that other than they have some veterans ahead of them. All right, and then the final thing is on the trademark stuff, and we talked a little bit about that on the OTA wrap-up practice, but do not take this as, there could be momentum for a new or different name. This isn't where that's headed. They are very confident that they'll eventually get this through, and other people I've talked to are confident that they'll get it through. It's just a matter of which avenue do they go down to do it, how long does it take? And I also have not, in talking to multiple people within the Harris Group, I have yet to sense any appetite from them to go through a name change process. Is absolutely not a top priority for them. Stadium and a lot of other things are much higher on any list. I'm not sure that the name is even on the list, to be honest, but not my decision. It will be a question that I know gets asked whenever the Harris Group does take over, if and when, and the Harris Group would say when. And I think a lot of other owners, Jerry Jones expressed very much some optimism earlier this week, or not optimism. He said they're going to do it. And Roger Goodell said this is where it's headed. So anyway, but I always kind of qualify that because until everything's signed and crossed off, you just always have to kind of say it like that. But with the name. Again, I have yet to sense any appetite for them to tackle, no pun intended, that issue. Anyway, so my point is, don't start getting your hopes up that this is going to go down that road where if it ever did, we're miles from that. So that's it. That's it for me. And I'm not here to puncture your hopes, but I just want to provide you with some realism and just with what I've heard. If I heard the opposite, I would tell you, and I haven't. So anyway, that's it for me. I will be back with another episode next week. We're going to have some clips from some of the OTA practices up on the Empire site. And so anyway, here's my conversation with SportsIllustrated.com's Albert Breer. Did you know the largest ropes course and zipline park in the country is right here in the DMV? Located in the heart of Montgomery County, the Adventure Park at Sandy Spring combines climbing and ziplining to create an aerial obstacle course unlike any other. With challenges anywhere from 10 to 75 feet in the air, there is something for all skill levels. Looking for some family time or the perfect date night before football season starts? You can even climb and zip line under the stars. Would you rather keep your feet on the ground? Give axe throwing a try. With their projector systems, you can throw at traditional targets, play tic-tac-toe, connect four, or even hunt zombies. Listeners of this show can get $5 off any ticket by entering the code KEIM23DC at checkout. That's KEIM, K-E-I-M 23DC. So there you have it, folks. Climbing, ziplining, axes, food, and bonfires right in your backyard. The weather is warming up, so it's the perfect time to head outside and join the adventure at www.theadventurepark.com. That's www.theadventurepark.com and enter promo code KEIM23DC. Albert, we could sit here and talk about Ohio State, and I think people can see in my background and yours. It may not be the topic that people want to talk about, so I'll just skip off that, except for it's like if it's about Chase Young or Terry McLaurin. But anyways, I do want to start with, first of all, thanks for coming on. But secondly, you wrote a big profile on Josh Harris the other day, talking to a lot of people who have known him a long time. And I'm curious in general, what was your big takeaway from writing that article?
That I think mostly that like Washington fans should be optimistic about where this is going. And, like that, not just like this guy's going to bring a level of investment, because I think most new owners in this day and age come in with the idea they're going to invest heavily. You have to be very, very wealthy just to get in the club in the first place. So you have to be capable of investing. They're not going to approve you otherwise. But I think the experience that he has as an owner with the Devils, with the Sixers, with Crystal Palace over in England, I think gives him, I think a level of expertise that maybe the Waltons lacked going into last year with the Broncos, or that David Tepper didn't really have, even though he's a minority owner with the Steelers going into owning the Panthers in 2019. It's obviously not all applicable, but there's a lot that is, and I think, sort of pointing to his desire to innovate, his willingness to kind of be hands off and empower people and find the right people. His the way like he runs a team is consistent with the way a lot of successful owners run their teams, which is they're involved, like they're not like absentee,
right?
But they're not like in the weeds of player personnel. They're not in the weeds of coaching. They're asking tough questions to the people they put in charge, but they're also empowering those people. So I think there are a lot of there's just a lot of things that I think are positive traits. And the great thing for Washington fans here, I think, is like he's already made some of the mistakes that owners generally make early in their time, with the Sixers and Devils. And so some of the growing pains that you'd normally have as a first-time NFL owner, he'll have some, but he's already gotten past some of those in his ownership of teams in the Premier League and the NHL and the NBA.
What do you think for guys like Tepper and, the newer owners, what do you think maybe is the biggest shock to them or the biggest thing they need to learn that he has already learned?
Yeah, like a lot of these people, these guys are, I mean, it goes without saying, you have to be a titan of whatever industry you're in, or you have to inherit, right? Like to
Right.
be in that position. So either you've got a sense of entitlement because you inherited it, right? Or you've been at the top of your profession. And so there's this feeling, I think, for a lot of guys coming in that you're like going to snap your fingers and be the smartest guy in the room. And that might not be the case because while Josh Harris is going to walk in that room and, he is a kingpin of private equity,
Right.
he's walking into a room where David Tepper walked into that room as a kingpin of hedge funds and where the Waltons are, basically American royalty, and Shad Khan, whatever it was, 12 years ago, came in as the king of auto parts. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
so a lot of these guys come in with this idea like, oh, well, I'm going to walk in and I'm going to have ideas that no one's ever had before. And a lot of times they've had time to think about what they would do. And so they have, I think sometimes you'll see them come in and they'll have a real strong feeling for what they want to, what they want to put in place and the sorts of things they want to do without realizing that maybe some of those ideas have already been tried by smart people
Right.
in the league and they don't work. Like I think Cleveland's a good example,
Right.
like Jimmy Haslam came in and he wanted to really lean into analytics. And how many fits and starts did they have to go through until they got it right?
Right.
And I think now they've got good people in place, but early on, like they empowered analytics people and pissed off the football people. Then they tried to kind of split it up. Then they just, and then they went all heavy football. Like it took a long time for Jimmy Haslam to get that mix right. Where when he came in, I'm sure he thought, I'm just going to think forward. I'm going to be the forward thinking person in this group without realizing that like a lot of the ideas that he had already been tried. So I think that's sort of like part of what you've got to work through. And Josh Harris has already had that experience, I mean, look, like the process in Philadelphia, that was with the first team he owned, like, and I'm sure there are a ton of things that he learned from that he wouldn't try with Washington because, he already stubbed his toe or fell on his face doing some of those things.
What
So I
is
think that's where like the experience of having been an owner before should really serve him, and that he's already made some of the mistakes that and at first time NFL owners typically make early on. That is the reason why a lot of times these owners will go through 2-3 GMs, 2-3 head coaches before they get it right.
Right. And it's funny because one of the things you talked about in that article is I think there was some conversation maybe with Adam Silver that he had about like there was a fear, would he have a short-term outlook? And that seemed to be, that was obviously
because it matched up with private equity, and like in private equity, I mean, look, like I would say, if you're in private equity, you've probably done some cutthroat things, like, so like that's the other side of it. But the concern, like with a private equity investor, would be that the guy, like, guy's made his money coming in and basically trying to, pull on every efficiency, like in some cases, gut companies and then sell them at a profit.
right.
And that was the concern with a private equity guy coming in was that, is that what it's going to be here? And, he promised to Adam Silver, he's like, I see myself handing this down to my children. Like this is going to be in my family for the rest of my life. And, sure enough, like you look at the patience with which he operated early on and letting the process play out with the Sixers and even with the way he built the Devils. And you can see it, you can see like, okay, like he took a long-term approach there and he didn't have an itchy trigger finger when things weren't going right. And this isn't something that he's looking at as, another page in his portfolio. And so I think, for that reason, some of the things that you look at him and some of the areas where you look and you say like, was it private as the NFL's first like private equity guy to become like a principal owner? Like, is there going to be those sorts of problems? Look, I think he's going to ask a ton of tough questions. And I think he's going to probably analyze everybody in the organization and assess everybody in the organization and how they're doing things and all that other stuff. But the evidence with the Sixers and the Devils shows that, he's willing to be patient. He's willing to invest deeply in the teams that he runs.
And there's people here should be asked tough questions of because they haven't won in a long time.
Right.
So that's what people should want. The other thing is that, when Dan Snyder came here, I know in talking to some people way back when, they worried about him knowing how to put together a team. What would it, because he wasn't really a team sport guy. Josh is a sports guy from growing up too. I mean, I
Yeah.
think he was a college wrestler to you that you talked about. How do you think, like, how does that help him in a situation like this?
Yeah,
Does it?
I think it was Jonathan Kraft who brought it up to
Yeah,
me.
he did.
Jonathan, for people don't know, that's Robert Kraft's son. He's the president of the Patriots. And, he sort of brought up like how he felt like that sport, lends itself to tenacious people, lends itself to competitive people. Like in other sports, you can be really, really talented and maybe not have like some of those traits. Maybe your teammates make up for it, or they
Right.
can hide it in certain ways. In wrestling, there's no hiding, and so like that's where Jonathan felt like it really came through and who he is as a businessman and how he runs his teams is how tenacious he is and how competitive he is. And that sort of mirrored what Adam Silver said about him and in saying like, for every fan who loses sleep over their team losing a game, I promise you that Josh Harris is going to lose more sleep than you do, And so I think that's it really is like the competitiveness and how important it's going to be for him to win. And and I think it even goes to another level in this case because I mean Washington's his hometown. And I when he had a conversation with Adam Silver about it. And Adam was frank with me. He said, like, my concern whenever something like this happens is like, all right, you're gonna shift your focus from one of my teams to another league's team.
Right.
And Josh explained to him flat out. He said, "This is a special opportunity. It's like I'm not going to lose sight of my goals with the Sixers, but he's like, hey, this is an important one for me because I'm from Washington and I grew up rooting for that team and I know what that team was, in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, like that. I like this is I think it almost like seems like what he said to Adam was like this is sort of a calling for him."
What else did you take away from that story? Because there are some other things you have Meek Mill in there, you have other stuff about marginalized communities. What do you think is something else that you really took away that is kind of highlights to you who he is and how it shapes him as an owner?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. Like again, like the trusting people. The real estate developer that I talked to, Greg Reeves, has said that and for those who didn't read the story, be sure to check it out.
Yeah,
But
SI.com.
yeah, but I had like the real estate developer was very, very was interesting to talk to on this because he said that they had some land that they were going to develop, and they were targeting like underdeveloped impoverished communities and trying to revitalize those areas. And they were raising money. And like part of the problem with some of the interest that they were getting is like people wanted to come in and take on a controlling interest, and sort of point the developers on what to do. And Josh didn't want to do that. Josh wanted to come in and Josh said, no, I want you to, I wanted this to be your show because I'm going to help you. But it's going to be your show. And, then Greg said that like, down the line when they were, working on the project and in the weeds of it, Josh gave him the best advice he'd gotten, which was you can't be a charity. Like charity's great. He's like, but you want people to want to invest in you. So don't just do this project based on, like on being a do-gooder. Make it a good investment for people. And, like that sort of advice helped carry them through. And I think that it's sort of indicative of a guy who he's going to invest in people. He's also going to push them and he's going to let them do their job, but he's going to constantly be making sure like that he's getting the very best out of them. And so I think that was a big piece of it for me was seeing who he was as a manager and who he was as a leader. And like, I think that that's going to be an important piece of, who he is as the owner in Washington. I also think, just kind of going through it and, like looking at his background and, kind of the way that he got involved with some of these teams and, the different levels at which he has been able to grow the teams. Like we all know the issues the Devils had, right? Like anybody who's followed hockey, like when they were winning Stanley Cups, they had trouble drawing, right? So, he invested a lot in trying to get the fans to come out to Newark to see their games. The Sixers are really popular. The Sixers like he's looking at building a new arena in downtown because he thinks that that's going to be the best thing to sustain the team. And that's something they don't have to do. I mean, it's not like the arena they have is dilapidated. He wants to, get into an arena that's going to be a better revenue generator for the team. That's also going to, be looking at where the fan's going to be in 2030 and 2040 and going forward. Why does that matter? Well, it's obvious, right? Like that's stadium development. That's rebuilding trust with the fans. And I think that that's going to be such an important part because, much better than I do how broken the trust has gotten there.
Trust is the biggest word. And I actually was talking to somebody in the Harris group the other day, and I said, like, that's one of the number one things you have to do is rebuild that trust. And
yeah,
I think they know that.
And I think like the stadium part of it's going to be important, because, the way I look at it with all these stadiums, man, like we saw with Thursday Night Flex this week, like the league doesn't give a crap about, about the fan in the stands anymore, so the league isn't going to do things that are going to make it easier for teams to sell out stadiums. Their priority is the television product because that's where most of the money's coming from.
Right.
So like teams are going to have to be more creative to entice fans to come out, and they're going to have to do more. That's what the scoreboard in Dallas is.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like that's what LA costing $6 billion is. Like that's what these things are. And so I think Josh is going to have a handle on that now with what they're spending for the team. How much are they going to be able to invest back into a stadium? I don't know. And if that stadium's in DC, how expensive is it going to be? That's an open question too. Right. So there are some challenges there, but I think he understands. I think the experience that he has in real estate development, the experience that he has in trying to attract Devils fans to Newark, the experience that he has in building a new arena, even when it might not be necessary quite yet in Philadelphia, the work that they're doing there, and it's not done yet, but the work they're doing there, I think should serve him well and trying to get a stadium project that works long-term done either in DC, Maryland, or Virginia.
And so again, people can check that out on SI.com. Let's go now to the field. The product he's actually going to get on the field. And I know you wrote a little bit about Sam Howell this week. We had a chance to see Sam Howell in OTAs earlier this week.
How do you look?
Honestly, it's funny because I think the ball jumps out. I think where the placement of the ball, and I talked about this on my podcast, but the placement of the ball on air is really good. And it doesn't always, it's on air, so you always take it with a grain of salt, except that I've seen a lot of quarterbacks here who don't put the ball in the right spot, even against air, right? And then when they were 7-on-7, some really good throws, 11-on-11, some aggressive throws that were picked, and throws that you probably shouldn't make. But like my thing is, you're a young quarterback, see what you can do, test it and see. Yeah. But I think his placement is pretty good. It gives guys a chance after the catch. But I'm curious what you've heard about him just in your.
Yeah. I mean, I think like, I'm sure it's a lot of what you've heard, John, why they believe in him. It's like that's the grade they had going into his junior year at North Carolina, which was like a low 1, high 2. Now, he didn't play great that year. Well, why? They lost Javonte Williams. They lost Diami Brown, who you guys are familiar with. They lost Michael Carter. They had all these NFL guys on the team his sophomore year, and then those guys were gone when he was a junior. They ran him, if you look at it, like 15 times a game. Wow. Like they turned him into Tebow because they didn't have any other answers. So, like in a lot of ways, he was taking one for the team, which hurt his draft stock. And then they grade him out, in January and February and March of 2022, and his grade was still like pretty good. Like I think it was like a low 2, high 3 for them. So and then you get to the point where like it's the 5th round, and they didn't want to like hurt Carson's feelings, so they didn't plan to draft one, but like the grade demanded it at that point. So there's that part of it. There's what he was showed on the scout team last year, which my understanding is like the defensive players would say to coaches, Sam looks really good. Like Sam is throwing with anticipation. He's throwing away from leverage. He's moving us with his eyes. He's doing these things on the scout team. Right. Then Carson goes on IR. He becomes the backup. He's showing he's absorbed the offense while doing all of this, right? So there's that part of it. And then he gives you just enough in week 18 to make you feel good about him translating it onto the field. So is it going to work? I don't know. I do think there's another level to this too, which is the saving money part of it. Correct. And which allows you to spend elsewhere. And I don't think it's just them, like Atlanta and Tampa are doing similar things where it's like, there's this pushback against paying for a middle of the road quarterback. Like, are you better off paying Derek Carr 40 or 35 million or Baker Mayfield 10 million? You know
Right.
what I mean? Like that's like the operative question here. Are you better off paying Jimmy Garoppolo 25 million or Sam Howell on a rookie deal and making him your starter? I sort of feel like that's what's gone on here in Atlanta and Tampa and
Yep.
Washington. To me are three good examples of how it's almost like the max contract in the NBA, where the NBA collectively decided we're giving too many guys max contracts, and the herd got thin. I think it's the same sort of thing here, where like the high end quarterback, like if you're paying for Mahomes, Josh Allen, Joe Burrow, Justin Herbert, Trevor Lawrence, you sign the check and you don't look back, right? Like if you're paying for a guy who is maybe like the 10th best quarterback or the 12th best quarterback or the 15th best quarterback, the price is so high now. Is it worth it? Is it worth doing it? And that's a question a lot of teams have contemplated. And, we saw three teams this offseason act on that. And I think Washington's in that group. So it's thinking a lot of Howell, but it's also like kind of strategically looking at it and saying, are we better off going and getting Derek Carr, or do we, have Sam Howell here, bring in Jacoby Brissett, and then, then we can take care of Daron Payne. Then we can look at extending Montez Sweat. Then we can bring in Andrew Wiley from the Chiefs. Allows you to do some other things that, is going to create a better environment for the quarterback to thrive in.
And I 1,000% agree with all that, because everything that you talk about, I've talked to people here about the same stuff, and that's all a big deal. The other thing is funny because you bring up the NBA, and it's like I'd hear GMs years ago talking about, if it's not a max player, don't give him a max contract.
Right. It's throwing great money at good players is not
right. Exactly. And so I know that's part of it, and they feel like if they can surround him with enough, then he can be good. What do you hear from people outside of Washington about him, about Howell?
About Howell?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of uncertainty. There are people that here's the thing about him. Like, everyone liked his makeup. Like, I remember going into that 22 draft, and that was seen as like a wasteland for quarterbacks, that class, right? But the two guys like that, like, were A+ character wise, where it's like, if it's in there, like, he's gonna find it. We're him and Desmond Ridder, which is interesting because they play for two of the teams we just discussed. But him and Ridder were kind of seen as these guys where the makeup was really, really, really good, right? And then the question is, can you get around some of the things physically that maybe they're limited with? With Ridder, it was accuracy. So can you develop the accuracy? And with Howell, I think it was more. With Howell is more size, and can he be effective? Can he win from the pocket consistently? With the type of player he is. So I think like a lot of people believe in the person. I think that there's some divide on where his ceiling is physically as a player. And again, like for most teams at this point, when you're looking at Sam Howell, they don't see what's happening in practice. They don't see what happened in training camp. So they're going mostly 90% of it for them is they're going off their college grade on him.
Right.
And the reality is everyone's college grade allowed for him to fall to the 5th round.
Right.
So while they like the person, there are like questions whether or not it's going to work.
Right. And you're right. Like, they haven't seen it. And I think that's what I'm curious to see in the summer, how it translates, because I have seen improvement from the time camp opened last year to now. And some of it's just going to be confidence, and you feel better. The footwork is better, et cetera. Where do you think this team, though, fits in a lot of it's going to depend on his play. But where do you think this team fits in the NFC East right now?
What's funny is like, I almost think like not that like he's like a bystander in this, but I don't think he's the biggest variable. Like, I think the biggest variable is what happens on the offensive and defensive lines.
Yes.
Like, I really do. Like, I think, like as much as you've invested on the defensive line, that group can't be just good. That group has to be great.
Right.
And that means getting more out of Chase Young. It means Montez Sweat staying healthy. It means getting the most out of Jonathan Allen and Daron Payne. Like, with what you've invested, that group has to be a top 5 group.
Right.
And then, I think a lot of the problems last year on offense weren't so much the quarterback as they were the line. So like, I don't know that like quarterback, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think quarterback was a huge problem last year. Now, did they have, Josh Allen back there? No. But like, I don't think it was like this. I don't think it was this train wreck last year.
Their line was an issue.
Huh?
Their line was an issue.
Yeah. And I think I think the line is the big thing, and so, how much does Andrew Wiley give you coming over from Kansas City? I think is a really, really big question. Like what does it look like with, guys like Charles Leno? Like I think that those are the big questions, and I look at it as if you are solid on the lines of scrimmage, you're going to be competitive in every game. That's how the Eagles are built,
Right.
Like
Exactly.
one of the reasons the Eagles have been so consistent is because they're consistently great in that area.
Right.
And so I think if they're better on the offensive line and elite on the defensive line, then they have a chance to compete with maybe anybody but Philly in that division. And Philly could take a step back. So, and I think that certainly in a weakened NFC could put them in the race for a wild card spot. And again, like a lot of that's gonna what sort of what sort of bump does Bieniemy give them?
Right.
That's a factor too. There are a bunch of swing factors, but I say the biggest one is how the two lines play. And if you can be good on the offensive line and great on the defensive line, you have a chance.
And so we'll wrap up with going back to Ohio State, but it's Chase Young. So going into a very crucial year for him, what do you hear about him and what would your expectations be for him?
Yeah. I heard that knee injury was a lot more serious than people realize.
That patellar tendon was a big deal.
Yeah. I heard I think a lot of people looked at it as a typical ACL and why isn't he coming back? Like I heard it was like in November and December, like it was not pretty the way he was. Like when they put him back out there in the practice field, there were a lot of people that were and I think like that's, I mean, really like legitimately, that's the biggest question now, And so that's why if I'm another team and I'm looking for I was looking for a pass rusher during the draft, I would have called Washington and seen what they might be willing to do there. So, look, like you saw what I did in 2019, and you know what he can be, and you saw what he was in 2020. I think this really does boil down to health and whether or not that knee, if this is like the sort of problem like Jadeveon and Clowney had, and I don't know how many of your listeners remember this, but Jadeveon and Clowney hurt his knee in his first game as a pro, had microfracture surgery, still wound up being a really good player, but that guy that we thought he was going to be at South Carolina, I think the knee injury kept him from ever becoming that guy. And so that's the question to me with Chase Young now is he past it or is he not past it? And I think if he's not past it, you hope he can get to, again, like that Clowney level where he can be a tough, hard guy to deal with, but maybe not the havoc wreaker that you thought he was going to be. And maybe he's an 8, 9, 10 sack guy. If he's fully healthy, the sky's the limit. Both you and I know that.
Right. And he can change games with how he plays. And you're right. You started hearing in the fall, it's the patellar tendon really complicated his recovery. Yeah. Because that really made it a difficult one to get back from.
And I think honestly, I think Clowney is the best example because Clowney really had to kind of reinvent himself as a player because of the injury that he had. Right. And, it's funny because you rarely see a career-ending injury, a true career-ending injury anymore. So we all think these guys always bounce back from everything. And there are injuries that they may not end a guy's career, but they do affect the way that he plays for the rest of his career. And so I just hope that this isn't one of those for Chase. And I think there were some encouraging signs at the end of the year, but I know when he first tried to come back from that injury, it wasn't pretty.
Nope, it was not. And it'll be a big storyline this year because, again, you talk about this D-line needing to be great. He's the guy that can take it from being very good to great because he can make game-changing plays when he's right. And some of that's going to be pass rush approach and all that. But I do agree. I think if he's healthy and right, he can make the kind of plays that turn games around.
Oh, I mean, can you imagine what does it become if Montez Sweat is suddenly your second edge rusher? You know what I mean? What does it become if they can't help on Payne and Allen inside, he can completely change the dynamic, 100% for everyone on that defense. If he is who he was his last year at Ohio State and his first year in the pros, he can generate interceptions for Emmanuel Forbes. Yeah. You know what I mean? That's the sort of player we're talking about.
Absolutely. Albert, appreciate you coming on. Tell people where they can find you.
You can find me at si.com, a variety of different, television and radio platforms. I won't bore everybody going through them. I think they're all in my Twitter bio. And yeah, you can find me on Twitter too, like the rest of us, right?
There you go. Thanks a lot, man. Appreciate it.
You got it.
That's it for this episode. Thanks to Albert for joining me, and thank you, as always, for tuning in. I'll be back next week, early next week, whether Monday or Tuesday, with another episode. And don't forget, there's another OTA session on Wednesday. I'll be out there and provide another wrap-up after OTA practice, just to give you the latest on what I saw from practice, because it's a lot of intrigue with this team. Where are they going to go? And it all starts right now. That's it for me. Talk to you next time.